Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dave with Evil Eye Games. Today's video, we're going to go ahead and add crouching functionality to our character. And basically, we just want the character to crouch down and animate appropriately and move appropriately based on his crouching position. Now, one thing I'm going to take care of real fast is in our test level here, we only have this small floor area that we can move around with, and we're going to need some more area so we can actually test movement out a little bit more. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce you guys into the geometry editor within Unreal Engine 4 real fast. So right now there's this static mesh that's on the floor here, and basically we can't resize it other than scaling, but if we scale it, it's going to disproportionate. So we're going to use the BSP system within Unreal Engine to go ahead and give us a better floor that we can stand on. So I'm going to select the floor piece here by left-clicking on it and hit the delete key to remove it. And over into the left, while we're selected on the Place tab under Modes, we're going to go into Geometry, and there's going to be all these shapes that we can go ahead and add and manipulate. I'm going to go ahead and drop a box into our environment by left-clicking and dragging it out into the world. And then I'm going to go ahead and center this. So in the details panel on the right here, I'm just going to set the location to 0, 0, 0. And that's going to place it at the center of our world. So we can go ahead and manipulate this box now. And to go ahead and edit this box at the top under Modes, I'm going to go to the Geometry Editing tab. And we're going to be able to manipulate this box a bit so that we can shape it to what we need. So we basically just need a floor. I'm going to set the snap size here to 50, so it'll be 50 centimeters. And you can select the different faces of this box when you're in the geometry editing mode by left-clicking on the face. So if I left-click on the top face here, I get a manipulator. I can go ahead and drag this down and manipulate the size of it. Likewise, if I grab the bottom one, I can go ahead and raise the size up a little bit. Like so. And I'm actually going to drag this one down. And I want the top surface to be flush with the grid plane that surrounds it. And then we can go ahead and left click on each one of these faces and drag them out a little bit more. So I'm just going to up this to 100 for the snap sizes. And then we can just drag out the ends of this to be a little bit bigger, so we have more room to run around on. And the size for this doesn't really matter right now. We just need a large enough area to go ahead and test out our movement, really. So maybe I'll make it a little longer in this direction down here as such. So we now have this BSP box that is on our area. So if we hit play, we have a much larger area to run around on, and we can test things out much better. So what we're going to do to start out with the crouch is we're going to go into our project settings, and we're going to have to set up a key to go ahead and crouch with. So at the top under Edit, Project Settings, we're going to go into our inputs once again, and we're going to create our first action mapping. So I'm going to hit the little plus button next to action mapping and then the drop down. And I'm just going to basically call this the crouch button. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit the drop down arrow next to it, and we can assign it a button. And I'm going to go with the standard control button. So if I search for the CTRL, it'll give us both the left control and the right control. So you can assign both of these keys if you want. I'm a righty with the mouse, so my left hand is over there. I can hit the control button really easy. So I'm just going to settle with the left control button. And we've done setting up our action mapping, so we can go ahead and close out of the project settings. And then we're going to have to take action when we hit that button. So we're going to go back into our blueprints and open up our player character. Now once we're in our player character, we're going to do like we did before. I'm going to grab this look input, and I'm going to drag this off over here. And we're going to right click in the graph, and we're going to search for the event for the action mapping we just created. So we're going to search for the crouch button. And we're going to take the input action. So, in order to crouch our character, we want to do a couple different things. We want to be able to modify the speed at which the character is moving at. We want to go ahead and track that he's crouching. And we also want to go ahead and change the collision bubble, or in this case, the collision capsule that is around the character to represent his new size. So if we go into the viewport here, obviously we've kind of touched on this before, but there's this capsule component here. So if I select the capsule component, it'll highlight it. And we have this pill-shaped object that handles the majority of our collision. So if our character crouches down, we want that to change sizes with our character. And what we're going to do in order to get this to work is back in our event graph here, with our input action, we have a pressed lead, execution lead, and we have a released execution lead. So obviously the pressed fires when we hit the control button, and the released fires when we release the control button. So what we're going to do in order to get the character to crouch is I'm going to right click in the graph and we're going to search for crouch. And under pawn character, there is a function called crouch. And likewise, I'm going to go ahead and search for crouch again. And right underneath our crouch function, there is an uncrouch function. So this functionality is already built into the character and his movement component so that we can automatically cause our character to crouch. Now there's already a variable that is built in as well. If we right click in the graph and search for get is crouched, there's already a variable under character that's get is crouched. So we can already use this to track it. We don't have to create our own variable. Now, technically, we can do all of this functionality ourselves, but then we would have to draw into question why are we using a game engine? And really, the point of using a game engine is to have pre-built functionality that makes it easier to build a game. Now, this crouch function is going to do everything we need it to do. It's going to be able to track that we are crouched, so it's going to set and unset the isCrouched variable. It is also going to go ahead and adjust our movement speed, and it is also going to adjust the capsule height. So I'm going to basically set this up right here so that when we hit the press button, it's going to fire crouch, and when we released it, it's going to uncrouch. Now, one thing to note here is that if you wanted to do something like a toggle, one way to carry out a toggle is basically, instead of hooking up the released to the uncrouch, I'm going to go ahead and break this. If we drag out from our pressed, we can search for a flip-flop. And then we can plug our flip-flop, the A into the crouched, and the B into uncrouch. And what this would basically do is every time the button is pressed, it would trigger either one of these inputs, and it would switch between the two. So the first time the player hit the press button, it would execute the A chain, which would fire the crouch function. And then the second time the player hit the press button, it would fire the B chain, which would uncrouch the character. So that's a really easy way to create a toggle. But in this specific case, I want to do it so that you have to hold the crouch button to stay crouched. So I'm going to go ahead and plug the pressed into crouched and the released into uncrouched. So the next thing we need to accomplish is going ahead and setting up our animations. I'm going to take care of the movement speed and the capsule height once we get our animations in place, because the animations are going to dictate how fast we're going to move and also how high the crouch height is. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hit compile and save, and we're going to go back into our main window, and I'm going to open up our animation blueprint. And basically what we're going to need to do is create a couple of states here so that we can go into our crouching position. So we're going to need an idle crouch. So once again, in our asset browser over here, I'm going to search for idle, and I'm going to pick out the crouch idle rifle hip. And I'm going to go ahead and drag this in, and I'm going to call this the idle _ crouched. And we're going to go ahead and plug that in. And I'm going to create a transition from our idle standing to our idle crouched, and one back over to the idle standing, so we can transition each way. And then for the transition rules, this is going to be really simple. So from idle standing to idle crouched, we're basically going to need to find out if we're crouched. But we're going to have to get the variable first. So back in our event graph here, we're going to have to go ahead and pull the is crouched from our character. Now, right now, we are treating our character as a pawn, and the is crouched variable comes from the character, not the pawn class. So in order to go ahead and treat this as our character, from our try get pawn owner here, I'm going to drag out, and we're going to search for cast to, and we're going to find our player character that we created. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this in after our direction. So I'm going to connect the execution chain from our set direction into the cast. And I'll put in a couple of redirect nodes here so that we can get our line around all of these nodes, and it will be easier to read. And I'm going to back this up a little bit right here. So much like that. So we come from our try get pawn owner down here, and we're going to go ahead and cast it. Now, a lot of people might be asking, what exactly is casting? And really the simplest answer for casting is you can replace the words cast to as treat as. So basically what we're doing is when we try to get the pawn owner, it's going to go ahead and get whatever is controlling our anim graph or whatever is running our anim graph. In this case, it's going to treat it as a pawn. So when we have the return value here, the return value is a pawn reference. So basically we have any accessibility off of this return node that is related to the pawn class. And we created a character, and a character derives from the pawn class. So we can go ahead and attempt to cast or treat as our character class. So by treating it as our player character, it'll go ahead and, well, first of all, it's going to do some error checking with us. You'll notice here that there's an execution chain that comes out that's unlabeled, and there's a cast failed that comes out, and then finally a pin that comes out that has a reference to our third-person shooter character. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to check our object, first of all, to see whether or not we can treat it as our player character. So if we end up changing the character class and using something else, it's going to run into this and it's going to say, hey, I can't treat it as a character, so I'm going to execute the failed. Or if it is a player character that we created or a descendant of it, it's going to go ahead and it's going to be able to treat it as our player character. So we gain all the access to functionality of our player character. So pretty much in short, you can just automatically, whenever you see cast to, just recognize that it is the engine treating it as whatever you're casting to. So once we have the as BP TPS player character here, I'm going to go ahead and drag out, and we're going to search for get is crouching. Or I'm sorry, get is crouched. So we're going to get the is crouched variable, and we want to go ahead and promote this to a variable within our anim blueprint. So I'm going to drag out from our return is crouched, and we're going to select the promote to variable, and then we're going to name it is crouched. So I'm just going to go ahead and place it on top like this. And we're just going to plug it into the successful execution chain from our cast. So all we're really doing here is every time the blueprint updates, we're going to try and get the pawn owner. And then we're going to try to cast to or treat it as our player character. So saying that we can successfully treat it as our player character, we're going to go ahead and we're going to try and set is crouched. And it's going to get the value from is crouched from our player character. So now we have a value that is tracking whether or not we're crouched in our anim blueprint. We can now make changes to our animations based on this is crouched variable. So I'm going to go ahead and head back over to our anim BP tab. And simply for this one, if we're transitioning from standing idle to idle crouched, We just need is crouched to be true. So I'm going to go ahead and take out the is crouched here and plug it straight into the result. So if is crouched is true, we can go ahead and transition from standing to crouched. So I'm going to hit the back button, and we have to do the transition back to the idle standing. So I'm going to double click on that transition. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to get the is crouched value again. And I'm going to drag out and we're going to search for not. And we're going to select the not Boolean. And we're going to plug the result into our can enter transition. And basically all we're doing here is we're getting the value of is crouched. And if it's not true, we can transition back. So we want to go from crouched to standing when is crouched is false. But in order to get the result here that we desire, in order to say that yes, we can transition, it's going to be the opposite value of is crouched. And that's exactly what the not node does. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit back. And we're going to hit compile and save. And we want to test it out in the idle stance to see if we can actually crouch. So at this point, we should have everything working, and I actually know that it's not going to work because I've already done this and I've been through this before. So if we hit the play button, and I click into here, and I hit the control button, nothing ends up happening. So we may be wondering why that's not working, and the fact is we have to actually enable crouching in our character movement. So we're going to have to head back to our player character, and we're going to select on the character movement component. And in the details pane at the top, I'm going to search for crouch. And under nav movement here, there is an option called can crouch. So we have to go ahead and enable that and compile and save, and we'll hit play again. And if I go ahead and hit the crouch button, our character crouches down. And you'll notice there's some jumpiness with the character, and we'll get to that. But our character is basically going ahead and crouching down to the crouch position. Now if we move around, he's going to stay in this crouch position because we don't have a blend space for him walking around. So let's go ahead and create one of those real fast. And this is going to be really easy. I'm going to go to the main window, and in our blend spaces here, we already have our TPS walk hip. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to go ahead and call this our BS underscore TPS underscore crouch hip. And this is going to be our blend space for when we're crouching and the weapon is at the hip. So I'm going to double click and open this up. And the first thing I'm going to do while I'm in here is change the vertical axis maximum value. Now I've already done quite a bit of the lead work on this, and I've already found a speed that works well with our character when he's crouching. So I'm going to go ahead and for the maximum axis value here, I'm going to go ahead and set this to 250. Now you'll notice on our graph here, it's going to bring the top value here down to 250, which is great. And we want to go ahead and replace these animations at the top with our crouched animations. So in our out-of-set browser here, I'm going to search for our crouch hip. And we're going to have the crouch walk backwards, forwards, left, and right. And we're going to want to supplant these animations at the top here. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on each one of these and hit the delete key to go ahead and remove them. And then we're going to do the same thing as before. So the center animation here is going to be the forward. So we'll find the walk. Where is it? There we go. I got lost somehow. The crouch walk forward rifle hip. We're going to bring that into the top. And then we're going to take the crouch left hit, and we're going to put it to the division to the left. We're going to take the crouch walk right and put it to the division at the right. And finally, we're going to take the crouch walk backwards and place it at both the top left and the top right corners. And if we go across the top here, we're going to see that he animates in each one of the directions. And at the bottom here, I'm going to go ahead and delete these. And we're going to do the same thing where we put the idle position at the very bottom. So we're going to find the crouch idle rifle hip and just drop it at the very bottom at these divisions. So at this point, if we go ahead and hold shift and left click and move around our graph here, we're going to see that he changes his position or his direction of travel based on which direction we're pointing to on the graph here, which is going to work excellent. It's basically the same concept as our other blend space. It's just that we change the maximum move speed because the crouch movement is slower than when he's up and moving around. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go back over to our Anim blueprint. And in our asset browser, I'm going to go ahead and search for our BS for blend space. And we're going to grab our blend space TPS crouch hip. We're going to drag it in. And I'm going to call this the walking underscore crouched. So at this point, we can go ahead and make transition rules. So we're going to need to transition between idle crouched and walk crouched, and between walking standing and walking crouched. So the easy one is from walking standing to walking crouched and back. So we're just going to go ahead and drag a line back and forth between each one of these. And this is going to follow the same rule as we did from going from our idle standing to idle crouched. So in the transition, moving from walking standing to walking crouched, we want to be able to do this when is crouched is true. So I'm just going to plug in our is crouched variable. And then for the return from crouched to standing, we basically want to get is crouched, perform a not Boolean, and then plug this into our result as such. Now, the transition between idle crouched and walking crouched is going to be the same transition as above when we transition from our idle standing to our walking standing. So I'm going to drag a couple of transition rules back and forth between our idle crouched and our walking crouched. And then for the transition rule for idle crouched to walking crouched, we're going to basically do the same thing. We're going to grab our speed and we're going to see if it is greater than 10. I'm going to plug the result into our can enter transition. And then for a return from walking crouched to idle crouched, once again, we're going to do the same thing that we did above. We're going to get our speed, and we're going to see if it is less than or equal to 10. And we're going to go ahead and plug in to our final result to enter the transition. So at this point, we pretty much filled out everything we need to fill out for this transition graph. Some people might be wondering why I'm not doing transition rules across from like walking crouch to idle standing, or I'm not doing idle crouch to walking standing. And the reason is because the transitions between these animation states are so fast that you're never going to see a glitch or catching in between states as long as your transition rules are set up appropriately. So if we let go of the if we let go of the crouch button and we stop moving almost simultaneously, being human, we're going to hit one of the buttons first, or we're going to let go of one of the buttons first, and it's not really going to be a noticeable time frame. So it's going to either make the transition up to the walking standing or over to the idle crouched first, and then it's going to make the transition back over to the idle standing. So these transitions happen so quickly and it updates so frequently that you don't have to make a transition rule for every single possible scenario. You just have to make sure that your transition rules are set up well enough so that you can go ahead and get from any point to any other point. One final thing we have to do is we have to go ahead and set up the inputs for our blend space. So inside of walking crouched here, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to plug our speed into the speed input and the direction into the direction input. Pretty simple, right? So let's go ahead and compile and save, and we can go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to hit play, but before I click into the game world here, one thing that you can do is I'm going to drag this off to the side, is you can go ahead and watch this in real time as it makes the transitions. So at the top here, we're going to select our debug filter, and you're going to see a instance for our player character in there. So there's the no debug option selected, there's the preview instance, and then there's the NMBP, TPS, player C, and yada, yada, yada. We're going to select that option. And this is going to show what is actually happening as we go ahead and preview the game in here. So if I go ahead and start walking, you're going to see that the anim graph up top is going to switch states. And if I stop walking, it'll switch back to the idle. So this is a really good way to debug in real time as you're actually testing things out. So if I hit the left control button, he's going to transition down to the idle crouch state. And if I start walking around, he's going to transition over to the walking crouch state. And you'll notice that we can go ahead and transition everything around pretty well. So he can move around and he animates. And if we are moving and I stop moving, he transitions back to the idle crouched. And if I let go, he transitions over to the idle standing. And you basically want to test just about every single pathway that you can. So we want to go from walking standing to walking crouched. So while we're moving, you can hit the control button and he will go ahead and move into the crouching state. If I let go of the movement component, he will go ahead and play his idle crouched animation. So at this point, it looks like all of the transition rules are working. And we can move between each state pretty reliably. So I'm going to go ahead and back out of there. And now I just want to take care of a few minor issues with our character. So we have our crouched hip. I'm going to close this out. And I'm going to go back to our main window and hit save all so we can save all of the changes we've made. And we're going to have to go back into the character and take a look at this character movement component. And once again, I have crouch search for in the details here. And we're going to have a couple of other options in here we want to take a look at. There's a crouched half height, and there is a maximum walk speed crouched. Now, I've already determined that the animation looks good at a speed of 250, so I'm going to set our maximum walk speed crouched to 250. Well, the next thing we have to do is make sure that the capsule is being reduced by an appropriate size. So in order to do this, we're going to go to our capsule component, and I'm going to go ahead and let's see if I can remember where it is in here. There is an option under rendering here that sets it to hidden in game. So if we go ahead and uncheck this and compile and save, what this is going to do is our capsule component is going to be visibly rendered. Now, it may be really hard to pick up on this in the recording and watching the playback on YouTube, but if you set it in your game, you're going to be able to see that it'll actually draw the capsule component on our character. And when we go ahead and hit the control button, you'll notice that the capsule height goes really, really small. It's actually smaller than our character itself. So we're going to want to adjust this. And it took me a bit of playing around with this. So I'm going to go back into the movement character movement component and search for crouch again. And the number that I ended up coming up with is a crouched half height of 70. So if we go ahead and compile and save and hit play, we can go ahead and hit the control button. And we want to make sure all the crouched height states are accounted for here. So when we're moving around, the character actually lifts up a little bit. And when we stop, he kind of sits on his haunches. So when we're moving, his head comes right about to the edge of the capsule component, which is perfect for our purposes. So it's right about the right height for our character. And by reducing the size of this capsule component, if you want the character to crouch and move underneath something, you can do that by adjusting his capsule height. And then when we let go, his capsule height goes back to regular size, and he would regularly be blocked by something that he could move underneath while he was crouched. Now, the one last thing I want to take care of is the noticeable instantaneous movement of the camera So when we go ahead and hit play and you hit the crouch button, the camera immediately snaps down because our spring arm is attached directly to the capsule component. So when the capsule component reduces size, its center point moves. So it brings the spring arm down with us, which is a good thing. We want the camera to transition downward. So as our character gets lower, the camera moves down with us. But we don't want this instantaneous jump in position. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go into the spring arm position here, and I'm going to clear out this search. And under, let's see, where is it? And underneath here under lag, we're going to add some camera lag to our camera. So basically it's just going to make the transition from different positions not so instantaneous. So we're going to click on the enable camera lag. And then we have a camera lag speed that we want to adjust. Now, the lower this number is, as long as it's greater than 0, is going to make a greater lag. So if you have a really low number like 1, it's going to take longer for the camera to move from position to position when it's moved. The higher the number is, the quicker it responds. And I've been toying around with this, and I set it to a speed of 40 that I think is really good for this. Now, one thing to note is this camera lag is going to apply to all other camera movement as well. So if you swing the mouse left and right when he's in any other position or any position at all, there will be some lag. Now, the setting of 40 gives us a nice smooth transition from standing to crouching, and it creates a lag in the mouse input movement that is practically unnoticeable. I mean, you really have to be paying attention and really know it. For something that would be a multiplayer game, you might not want to add in that camera lag. But for a single-player type game, it's not going to be something that's noticeable, and we're not making a Twitch shooter, so the few milliseconds really isn't going to hurt the gameplay all that much. So let's go ahead and hit compile and save, and we'll hit play. So once again, if we hit the control button, it seems like there's a little bit smoother of a movement going from the standing to the crouched position. And if we move around and move our mouse left and right, if you really pay attention to it and you're sensitive to it, you'll notice that there is a little bit of lag in there, but it is barely noticeable. But our transition from our standing to our crouched is significantly smoother. So at this point, we've set up everything we've wanted to do. So I'm going to go ahead and put a comment box around our crouch button here. And I'm just going to call this what it is, the crouch button. And then we can move it on the graph where we want to. And of course, we have a dirty compile because we changed something on the graph. So we'll compile and save. And that's going to finish today's video. So if you guys have any questions or comments, you can go ahead and leave them down below. I'm also going to leave a link to my Facebook page. So if you want to follow me over there and keep up with some news and whatever else I end up posting over there, you can go ahead and like me over on Facebook. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.